Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.
All right, welcome everybody. We are very happy about your interest. Also the people in the back, please just come in front. We have some seats left for you. I'm looking forward to the next 1.5 hours with the side events with plenty time for discussion. My name is Lukas Fehr. I'm the transfer manager for the research program CDR Terra, and I'll be your host for this event. So I'm just quickly going to walk you through what we are planning to do today. We have presentations by the scientists and on this panel, and then we want to start with you into a podium discussion. So it's plenty of time for you and your thoughts and questions and comments. So before we start with the presentation, I would like to present you the panel, and I'm going to start with Julia Pongratz. She's professor for physical geography and land use systems at the LMU Munich and spokesperson of CDR Terra. And she's also part of the core team of the global carbon budget. The new report just got introduced and published today. And she's also contributing author to the UNEP GAP report and IPCC assessment reports. Next to her, we have Andreas Oschlies from GEOMAR. He's professor for marine biogeochemical modeling at the GEOMAR and co-chair of the research mission CDR Mare and the Global Ocean Oxygen Network, as well as the Global Ocean Oxygen Decade Program, and co-author of the recently published Guide to Best Practices in Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement Research, which is also something you can get information at some side events tomorrow. Then next we have Jessica Strefler from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where she's a senior scientist and lead of the carbon management team there. And she's highly engaged in a couple of research programs, and I'm just going to name those that are related to CDR. Ariadne, Retake, and CDR Sintra. Next up, we have Oliver Geden, Head of Research Cluster Climate Policy and Politics at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and Research, and he's also Research Associate at the University of Oxford. And you might know him because he has a strong focus on European and global climate policy and CDR, and is also the vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 3 and co-author of the State of CDR report. Which brings us to our last panelist, who is also a co-author of the State of CDR report, Steve Smith. He's executive director of 2 programs by the Oxford Smith School. That's Oxford Net Zero Initiative. It's a multidisciplinary program on how to reach net zero, and CORE research hub with focus on the removal of greenhouse gases. So I'll hand over to Julia to start with the presentations.
Okay, thanks very much, Lukas, for introducing us here. So our task is to discuss the challenges that we need to overcome on our way to implementing carbon dioxide removal. And I'd like to start us off with a few general thoughts that we're all on the same page on these challenges. But first, why do we need CDR, CO2 removal after all? So you probably know this graphic from the IPCC's last assessment report, which shows these stylized pathways towards the Paris Agreement's goals. So CO2 or all greenhouse gases together need to reach net zero within the next few decades, CO2 earlier than all greenhouse gases. And the CDR comes in there because, as the IPCC says, the deployment of CDR to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. What's very clear from this graphic is that we need rapid, drastic emissions reductions, first and foremost, and we've seen great success, for example, in scaling up renewables. What we don't see such success in is in phasing out the fossil fuels. But then we need to have CDR, at least by the amount of residual emissions that will persist. So there are hard-to-abate sectors like aviation, shipping, heavy industry, agricultural practices. Some of them we will not be able to bring them down to zero greenhouse gases entirely, we believe. But I also need to say that we haven't fully finished the discussion societally of what residual emissions really are, how much do we allow certain actors or activities to keep on emitting. But the amount of residual emissions will determine how much CDR we need. Jessica Strefler is going to speak about scenarios and these issues later on. I'd like to give you 3 examples, staying here with this figure, of the challenges that we may need to overcome with CDR. So the first is, I wrote here that residual emissions need to be small to limit risks and side effects from CDR. Why? Well, if we get to large residual emissions, therefore large CDR deployment, we may, for example, need a lot of land, in particular in the next few decades, and this may then interfere with the production of food and fiber. Of course, there's win-win situations you could even create by changing diets, as we're again seeing later on, that could help here. Then, if you look at all these beautiful restoration maps for forests that come out in the recent years, you realize that many of them put high restoration potentials, reforestation potentials in regions that have very weak land tenure or rule of law, in the global south in particular. And so there you also see these challenges, how to make the CDR really permanent, but also issues of equity, because this is really something that's not evenly distributed, our demand for CDR, but also how well it could be implemented across the globe. And lastly, there's also regulatory frameworks that pose challenges that could potentially be overcome, for example, if ocean alkalinity enhancement is allowed or not, if CCS is allowed in specific countries or not. Oliver will speak about regulatory frameworks in a bit. You see on this graphic that vegetation-based CDR has featured already in the past, and indeed this is something we've been doing for a long time, not necessarily with climate protection in mind. But now to make it attractive as CDR option, we need monitoring, reporting, and verification. And Andreas will speak about MRV in a second. How to bring this also up, what international cooperation there might be needed, Steve is then later pointing out. So a bit of terminology up front. What is really CDR? And there's 3 principles of CDR that the State of CDR report also nicely summarized, that Steve here has been leading. So first, the CO2 captured comes from the atmosphere. It does not come from fossil sources. The second is the storage needs to be durable. And the third, the results, it needs to be the result of direct human intervention, so it needs to be additional to natural processes. You see with CDR, here one example, CO2 taken up by forestry could be also taken up by direct air capture and then put to permanent storage, could stay in the forest, it can be put into geological reservoirs. That's CDR, that fulfills all principles. CCU, by contrast, draws down the CO2 from the atmosphere, but it's then not put into durable storage, but it's being reused because it's a chemical product or because it's used as fuel. This clearly is not CDR. And then CCS doesn't take the CO2 out of the atmosphere in the first place, but it's typically point source where you do the carbon capture, and then you, like with a fossil plant, and then you put the CO2 back into geological reservoirs or other long-term storage. So it becomes clear that CCU and CCS do share some components that may be relevant for some CDR options. For example, bioenergy with CCS you can't do without CCS. But it's something very different in the end. CDR is much more than that. And of course, this debate becomes very important also here now at COP when it's discussions are around phasing out only unabated fossil emissions, but we need to be very honest of how much CCS we can deliver with being economically useful, societally acceptable, and so on, and how much we can not do on mitigating fossil emissions there. Permanence is, of course, an issue always. It's not binary. There's not permanent or non-permanent. But durable really means that we are speaking of decadal to century scale storage of CO2. Now, why is it so important to overcome the challenges? Well, there's currently a big gap between what we do in terms of CDR, what we want to do, and we see here depicted again from the State of CDR report, and Steve can certainly answer questions in detail on this. We see that currently, here on the very left-hand side, we have about 2 billion tons of CO2 removed each year, almost exclusively from the forest sector. And when you look into the NDCs of the countries by 2030, this is supposed to go up. And if you go to 2050, long-term strategies, net zero targets, this will grow even further. Of course, the future, we will come to that with the scenarios, is uncertain. How much CO2 CDR we'll really need depends on the pathway we choose, how much renewables demand reduction is taking place, and so on. But what's robust across these different scenarios is that we're doing less CDR than what we need to be compatible with the Paris scenarios. CDR is already deployed. As we see, this is almost entirely in the forest sector and some other land use CDR, mostly in developing countries. This is also something that brings us back to these equity issues and challenges. What is also needed to overcome these gaps is that we are clear that we set and signal priorities. When we look into what industrial groups, for example, promise also in scaling up, this is almost without precedence in history. But to make that happen, there needs to be reliable frameworks, and also the innovation needs to be substantially accelerated to get there. But let us get more concrete now. Let us look into the methods of how to really remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And here in Germany, we've got two big funding measures, as Lukas mentioned, that look into all these different methods, CDR Terra on land, CDR Mare in the ocean. I'm just going to highlight a few of the land-based methods that we do. So apart from afforestation and BECCS that I already mentioned, biochar is also tested and assessed. Re-wetting of peatlands is emission reduction, but also carbon dioxide removal. Agroforestry is investigated in much intensity. Also, it's a good chance to reap these co-benefits of making ecosystems more climate resilient, while at the same time providing CDR. You see novel approaches like artificial photosynthesis here, or also how to make house walls, carbon negative house walls out of algae oil. There's experts right here, Kolja Kruse, Britta Waschel in the audience, if you'd like to know more about this new type of CDR. And I hand over to the marine realm.
Yes, thank you very much. So we also have as a small left corner here the ocean. It's where the scale is not right. It should be the opposite, of course. That's maybe the most important result of space. All the space programs we know, it's a blue marble or a planet, so it's mostly ocean. And that's what the ocean offers and has done in the past, in the geological past of the Earth. It has removed CO2. All major historical catastrophes, continental breakups, pushed a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the ocean cleaned it up. It will do it again. It takes hundreds of thousands of years, and we don't have that much time if we just wait and rely on the ocean. So there are some ideas now to use the ocean more, aggressively, and try to manipulate and accelerate these natural processes. These are first biological methods, mangroves, seagrasses, macroalgae, salt marshes. Same on Earth as on land, afforestation basically. There's also chemical methods, what we call alkalinity enhancement. That's the capacity of the ocean to take up acid. So it's putting alkaline substances into the ocean to make the ocean, well, neutralize carbonic acid and allow the ocean to take up more CO2 from the atmosphere. So these are the two major methods, biotic ones, as we have on land as well, and abiotic ones, mostly chemical, closely related to chemical weathering on land, of which the byproducts will end in the ocean as well, washed by rivers, groundwater into the ocean, and remain there for very long timescales, hundreds of thousands of years, as salts of the carbonic acid. It is, however, clear, so far we consider land-used approaches in all the official trading systems only, and we have to scale up things very quickly. Scaling up is probably the biggest advantage of the ocean because of its large scale, large volume, and long residence times. But it's so far clear we cannot rely on a single method. We need all hands on deck, basically. We have to try many approaches, and all scenarios we have will end up with the many portfolios of different approaches used simultaneously if we want to reach our promised climate goals. IPCC in the last assessment report used this graph, so that's already a process of this IPCC negotiations. It ended up as a compromise, as a gray color, and to dilute strong messages, of course. But here we have different scales. We have the colors, that's biological, the white ones, and biotic methods, which often are called green or natural, and the more chemical ones, the darker gray shades on this plan. On the bottom line, you see the durability. So we have intermittent storage, decayal, centuries, millennia, and longer time scales. And often you see that biotic methods have shorter storage timescales, and chemical ones tend to have longer ones. So there's trade-offs, of course, what we like. Chemistry usually sounds awful and dangerous, but it might be much safer than having a forest that might burn down or under global warming or might be threatened by droughts and changes in precipitation. It's clear here we have different dimensions, and that's what we do in CDR Terra and CDR Mare. We try to develop, or we do develop, successfully I think, assessment criteria and a matrix, what really can be used by society, by you, to in the end decide what could be done, what should be done, what must be done. And we can't do it along a single dimension. We need multiple dimensions. And that's where we're up to. We also don't need only natural sciences. We need many more disciplines to have a comprehensive description of things. And we have a couple of methodological challenges here. And that's concerning monitoring, reporting, verification. So if we want to use this efficiently, we have to make sure really we remove carbon from the atmosphere. That's where we don't want to have it. So is it additional, or would it happen anyway? Is it durable? What are the uncertainties? How do we measure it? How do we model it? How do we project into the future what might happen next year or after the next extreme event we have under global warming? And we have side effects, non-CO2 effects, other greenhouse gases, changes of the color of the planet, that changes the radiation, and we have monetary and societal costs. So all this has to be considered. And here we can rely, I think, on publicly funded research, so taxpayer-funded research. That's, I think, the most best way to avoid biases, avoid vested interests. And science is doing this right now, developing ideas, methods for MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification. And also to provide guidelines, what should be done. Since science cannot do it alone, we can't, science is, particularly publicly funded science is far too slow. So we have long lobbying times before we got these CDR Terra, CDR Mare funded. It took years, many years to get this through. It's a review process, of course, necessary. But startups can work much faster, and economy is much faster. So we need that to scale things up, test things. And here we need this collaboration between academia, startups, economy, philanthropy to fund things. But we need guidelines, and that's what we do as well from the science as a bottom-up process. We have just released it, and we'll release it tomorrow, actually, at 8 o'clock in the Ocean Pavilion, a guideline on ocean alkalinity enhancement research, best practices that we think are current best practices. They will evolve, of course. So we need open transparency, data have to be public, and we also would like to have a repository of things that go on, experiments in the field, in the environment particularly. I think that would be good to have a registry where you want to, what we want to do to allow all of us to speed up knowledge generation as fast as possible. We have benefits of all this collaboration, of course, proper accounting, so not to run into wrong directions where many people can earn a lot of money, but where it's no use for the environment and for climate. And also efficient allocation of our resources, of money, of brain power, of land, of water, nutrients, and so on. So there's an increased chance, and that's why we are here at COP, to bring people together, bring industry, startups, academia together, also different levels, national, European, continental-wide, and global funding agencies and ideas. Then we go to the German.
Yeah, so we've heard now that CDR is really a crucial part of climate change mitigation strategies. What's less clear is how much CDR we will need. And I would like to start out with a global perspective. And what you see here are the illustrative mitigation pathways from the last IPCC report. And you can see that really they show different strategies in terms of residual emissions, where do these emissions come from, and also how much residual emissions are left. And that determines the amount of carbon removal we need. And also in terms of which carbon removal options are deployed, these strategies differ. But you can see that they're roughly in the order of 3 to 5 gigatons CO2 per year. And that's also the median of the AR6 scenarios. It's roughly 5 gigatons in 2050. The spread, the range is quite large, but that's sort of a ballpark estimate that's about 10% of current greenhouse gas emissions. However, almost all of these scenarios assume immediate climate policy. So if we have further delay or if the transition is slower than expected, then the carbon removal demand will increase. And that's what you see on the two left scenarios. They don't assume current immediate climate policy, and they can see the CDR demand immediately increases. So this can rather be seen as a lower estimate, and that also shows that CDR cannot be used as an excuse to delay mitigation ambitions. We really need both immediate and aggressive mitigation, but also development of carbon removal options so that we really have it available at the scales that we need. And I would like to illustrate that point a bit more clearly on the German example. So here you see the current emissions in Germany, or current is 2020 in this case. And you see here the large brown part, that's CO2 emissions from the energy system. We have roughly 780 megatons CO2 gross emissions. Most of that is CO2 from the energy. And now let's just assume for a moment that the energy transition will be fully successful. So we would be able to avoid all of those CO2 emissions from the energy system, and also all of those emissions from the waste sector. And on top of that, we have some efficiency gains in the industry. If that happened, then we would cut current emissions from 780 megatons CO2 to only 127 megatons of CO2 per year. But that's still quite a bit. That's about 15%. That's more than those 10% we saw in the global scenarios. And that's the main remaining sources are CO2 emissions from industrial processes, so for example from cement production. Then we have emissions from the agricultural sector, that's CO2, but it's also methane and N2O. And we have emissions from land use, and in Germany that's mainly from drained peatlands. So those emissions amount to 127. What can we do to further reduce these emissions and to therefore reduce our reliance on carbon removal? Well, for the industrial process emissions, it's quite hard if we don't find other building materials, which could be possible, then the only other option is CCS, so carbon capture and storage. If we have that, we can not fully avoid these emissions because not all of them are large point sources, but to a large extent we can reduce them. For agriculture, we don't really have a lot of technical options. Here really the big lever is dietary changes. So if we And here we are again very optimistic in our assumptions. We assume that the whole diets in Germany change towards an Eat Lancet diet and reduce the demand for animal products by 2/3. So again, optimistic assumptions. So that would then reduce the animal stock and therefore also reduce the emissions. And on top of that, it would also free up land that is used for animals and for feed production. And the third point, the land use emissions, well, that's quite obvious. We can start to rewet the peatlands. Not all of them can be rewetted, but if we would use the full theoretical potential, then we could reduce the emissions by the largest amount here of all of those options. But we would need additional land because on the current drained peatlands, there's agricultural production, and then you would need those would need to shift somewhere else. So that's taken into account in this study. So if we do all that, then we can halve the residual emissions from 127 to 62 megatons CO2 equivalent. So that's it's more of the area of other studies that have looked at residual emissions and that have been sometimes even more optimistic than our assumptions. So now the question is, if we have that range of 62 to 127 megatons CO2 equivalents per year, do we have enough carbon removal to actually meet that demand? And for that, we looked at a broad range of different options. Actually, only the land options. We didn't consider the ocean options, just because it was very hard to find a good estimate. But that's one of the caveats that could change the picture. But we looked at almost, not all, but a broad range of options. And I distinguish here the land options, so that's existing forests, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, and agroforestry. They have all the advantage that they're rather cheap. We don't need a lot of technological improvements, but the storage is not long-term, and some of these options have saturation effects. So you would not be able to sustain the carbon removal for long term. And they are potentially reversible, so for example, due to climate damages or changes in management practices. Then we also considered biochar, which is a more medium-term storage option, and it's less vulnerable to reversal. And we considered the more technical options, bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, and enhanced weathering, so that's geological or chemical storage. That's long-term, it's not reversible, but we have less experience with that, so we need more technical development, and they tend to be more expensive. And what we see here is, even though we took this very broad range of options into account, and we were very optimistic on the emission reduction side, so remember, fully successful energy transition, the supply and demand don't match. Only if we take into account those additional options and we reduce the residual emissions further, that in turn also influences then the amount of carbon removal we have. For example, CCS, that can be used to reduce the industry process emissions, but it can also be used for bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture with CCS. So there, CCS is a crucial component. Or remember that the peatlands required land, and the dietary changes freeze up land, and then these land changes then can be either used to regrow, to reforest, or to have more bioenergy, for example. So only in this scenario where we have all options, both on the emission reduction side and on the CDR side, there we have sort of a safety margin in the matching of removals and residual emissions. And this safety margin is really needed because all of the assumptions are so optimistic that it's quite probable that they will not play out in reality as we have them here in the scenarios. So. Yeah, but I think with this, I hand over to Oliver for the policy. You have our own mics.
Yes, when you look at potential policymaking action, the UNEP Emissions Gap report just released defines 4 priority areas, and I'm going through them because it was part of the chapter, and then we look at Germany and the European Union, what we are already doing and what is still out to be done. So the first one, the UNEP emissions gap report recommended, is setting political priorities, establish them, and also signal these priorities. You can do that with sub-targets for emissions reductions and carbon removal, for example. So it would be pretty clear that the bigger effort will come from reducing emissions. Look at volumes, specifically for countries. What are the volumes we're actually talking about? What Jessica just did, but it would be wise if governments would start planning like that. Here it says gross volumes, because in land use change and forestry, in Europe we often only talk about the net fluxes, which is kind of problematic because it hides your remaining residual emissions even in that category. In Germany, for example, emissions from peatlands, really it's 50 million tons per year. That's larger than industrial process emissions in Germany. And they're not going down, it's just the share in the overall emissions are going up. Preferred methods, we need such a discussion, and we will have that because the whole suite of methods that Andreas showed will not be used in any countries, and that's a legitimate decision to be made. The second element, and Andreas already referred to that, need for robust measurement, reporting, and verification to establish credibility, let's say in two senses of the word, through strengthening existing and creating new regulation, including on durability. If we count forestry afforestation as carbon dioxide removal, as we should, then of course you already have rules. They need to be strengthened. We can also learn from our rules and how we apply them. And durability is of course an issue, and I'm saying durability here, and the report says durability, because if you call it permanence, then it's quite often an either or, where you could, it's probably better to account for, let's say, different types of durability, and probably like in the IPCC report, have at least 3 classes here, not just say it's either permanent or not. Third issue is need to enhance synergies and co-benefits. Could be biodiversity, could be revenue streams for companies, could be jobs in certain area, could also synergies with adaptation, for example, mangrove forests in tropical areas. And the fourth one, innovation and learning, that needs to be accelerated. At some point for the non-LULUCF options, you want to see demonstration projects, experimentation also with regulation, what really incentivizes, what might create perverse incentives. You don't know how actors will react to these incentives and regulations. So that's specifically for novel CDR methods like direct air capture with CCS, biochar, enhanced mineral weathering. So these are 4, let's say, high-level recommendations. And if you look at both Germany and the European Union, what you see now that the train that has left the station is not just a carbon dioxide removal train, it's actually a carbon management train. So we're doing this in parallel. Carbon management now on the left hand, I will not go deeply into that, mainly in the German and European version, European Union version, concerning CCS and CCU in industry, primarily on fossil CO2, but in the German carbon management strategy, also in the European carbon management strategy, it will also talk about bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture with CCS in industry. In Germany, we will discuss a new CO2 storage law, both for CCS with fossil fuel CO2, but also for BECCS and DACs. Contracts for difference, one of the usual ways to incentivize new installations. On the European Union, we have integration of CCU and ETS, not so much a CDR issue. In the Net Zero Industry Act, we have now negotiations between Parliament and the Council starting soon. In the original version by the European Commission, CDR, carbon dioxide removal, was not defined as a strategic area, but it's probably going to be that way, at least the Parliament wants that. And what's really important is the design of the next phase of targeting net emissions in the European Union. But that comes up on the right hand again with carbon dioxide removal, where Germany is now preparing a long-term strategy on carbon dioxide removal and residual emissions. We quite often call it a CDR strategy or negative emissions strategy. It's not there yet, so it might be only about that, but in the original phrasing of the coalition treaty, that was ought to be a strategy on what they called in the coalition treaty technical negative emissions or negative emission technologies and residual emissions. And I think that's quite important because on our way to net zero, this will be the same number if a target has to be achieved domestically. And then we should not say, oh, look, here's our CDR potential, so that's what we can have in terms of residual emissions. We should also look critically at the residual emissions that we are, let's say, likely to have. It can only be corridors. We don't know exactly what will be hard to abate, impossible to abate in 2045, the year for the German net zero target. Then we are already decided, kind of the government did that, it's not in the law yet, to have sub-targets for CDR methods beyond LULUCF. So we have an ongoing process for adjusting the German climate law. The main discussion is about something else on that climate law, but what has already been proposed by the government is to set sub-targets for BECCS, direct air capture with CCS, potentially also others that has not been decided yet, under that climate law from 2035. And we also have an action plan on nature-based solutions. I was kind of surprised to see that this is really the official name in English if you go to the website of the ministry, but it is. In German it's natural climate protection. It's quite close, but yeah, it's the action plan on nature-based solutions, where you find a lot on land use and land use change, also on peatlands, but it's going beyond CDR, obviously. And on a European level, we have, for a long time now, a regulation on land use change and forestry that already sets net negative targets on an EU level, and its latest revision until 2030 will set, or is already setting, net negative emissions targets for all countries. And looking at the Danish colleagues, among the few countries that currently have net positive emissions in that area, it's going to be quite challenging. One of the big fights will be the next bullet, the integration of carbon dioxide removal in emissions trading. With the adjustment under Fit for 55, the Commission is tasked to come up with a report if and how you could do that. We have a certification framework under development, also negotiated between Parliament and the Council of the Member States. So you see many things are still ongoing. I would say it's a framework where the political effects are likely to be overestimated, but it's one of the few games in town, and I think it will set precedent for the methodology work that we need to do in the European Union and globally anyway. And again, the 2040 target design. The 2040 target design is important for several reasons. In 2030, when we switched from minus 40% to minus 55%, for the first time, we started accounting for the net contribution and the net negative contribution from land use change and forestry in achieving the target. Historically, the European Union has had net negative LULUCF values. We kept that at 225 million tons. But in 2040, I guess we will just need to decide about a new cap. We will also have then probably BECCS, DACs, whatever online. And the question is, will we get a sub-target there? And will we get an idea of the trajectory towards the European net zero year? And will we get an idea what countries want to do? Because we have a union-wide net zero target for 2050. which, if you take that seriously, and some countries taking that very seriously, means that some countries in the European Union will be above net zero in 2050, which naturally means that others have to be net negative already in 2050. And that's not only Poland, the Czech Republic, your usual suspects. One country that will really have trouble to get to net zero is Ireland, because 33% of their emissions now come from agriculture, with a lot of methane in there. And if you don't change that sector, I don't see how they get to net zero. And just to show you one element that's going to dominate the discussion is that we have in the European Union right now 3 pillars of climate policy. It's LULUCF, already net negative. It's the ETS, and here now only the ETS 1, so the first version, large industrial installations and industry. And we have the non-traded sectors, what we currently cover under the effort sharing regulation. They don't go to net zero in the same year. Again, LULUCF is already net negative, but also ETS 1, after the Fit for 55 adjustment, and that's what it shows here, is supposed to go net zero or zero. Right now there is no CDR in there, already around 2040. We have a so-called linear reduction factor for issuing new allowances every year, and the old assumption was that will happen in the late 2050s, that's the blue line. Now it would happen around 2040, which means even if you use CCS in the cement sector, you never have a 100% capture rate. You would have to close down these installations. So you somehow need to integrate carbon dioxide removal in there. And while many would say, yeah, okay, we saw that coming, the interesting part is here, what does it do in the debate? For years now, since the Paris Agreement, scientists have argued, yeah, well, if you look at the global scenarios, you can only achieve 1.5 with a certain amount of CDR, and it obviously means that Germany and European Union have to do something about CDR. If you don't like CDR as a policymaker, you don't listen to this because, you know, it's global models, all these assumptions. But this here is a policy problem that policymakers created themselves. And based on more ambition, not on less ambition, which is often the idea why we do need to talk about CDR. This comes from the Fit for 55 revision of the ETS directive, and it means we have to find a solution for that. And the mood changes in the room quite significantly, because people in administrations means, no, yeah, right, this is based on a decision we have taken, and now there will be follow-up to decisions we need to get into. So in the European Union, whatever you think about integrating CDR in the ETS, this is going to be maybe not dominating the debate on CDR in the European Union, but it will be a focal point of the debate because policymakers have created a policy problem themselves that the way it is now can only be solved by CDR. Thank you. And you doing without slides, I think.
I'm going without slides, that's right. So wish me luck. So hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Steve Smith and I'm British and based at the University of Oxford. So I would like to start by saying I'm very honoured that you chose me to be the representative of the rest of the world here on the panel, and I will try to live up to that. I'm very interested to know actually a bit about the audience here and how many of you work on carbon dioxide removal or not. And there is no right or wrong answer to this, right? But if you work, and if you would say you work on some aspect of carbon dioxide removal, could you put your hand up? Quite a few, yeah. And if you would say you don't work on it, could you put your hand up? Okay, so that's actually a good mix. That's nice. And how many of you focus your work in Germany? How many of you are German-based? Would you put your hands up? And how many are, thank you, outside of Germany? Okay, we've got a really nice mix, actually. That's good to know. Thank you. So obviously, a lot of my work is focused on the UK, but then I also think internationally, collaborating with several people on this panel, for instance, on the state of carbon dioxide removal work, which you saw some of. And I've been asked to just share a few thoughts from a slightly more international perspective. So I will give 3 ideas for where I think there are focus areas for research internationally. But first, I will just tell you very briefly about what's going on in the UK, for those of you who don't know on this, particularly from a kind of research angle. And a couple of things, actually, that I really like about CDR Terra and CDR Mara. So in the UK, I lead what's called the Core Hub. That's CO2RE, so the 2 is silent. And that's the sort of national research hub funded by UKRI, so the public research funding body in the UK. And in a sense, that has quite a few similarities with the work we discussed. It's multidisciplinary. So we have people who are techno-economic specialists, systems modelers. We have people who work in law, in ethics, in policy. We also have people who work on some of the fundamentals of some of these, especially in the land sector. But one perhaps difference is that the program is structured so that CORE sits to work very closely with 5 demonstration projects. So we have 5 consortia in the UK that are trialing 5 different carbon removal methods in various locations in the UK, actually trying to test these out at field scale. They happen to be all sort of different, arguably land-based methods. One is about planting trees at scale, so arguably not really a new technology, but still a lot of work to work out how you put into practice the philosophy of right tree in right place and get those multiple co-benefits. One is on biochar, one is on enhanced rock weathering, one is on growing perennial biomass crops which can be put into bioenergy systems with carbon capture and storage, so BECCS. And the other one is peatland restoration, which when you have degraded peats is in the short term an emissions reduction option, but if you do that well, then that becomes a carbon removal option in the long run. So we're working in quite a focused way on actually trying to try some of these methods and learn about the MRV processes, learn about what this looks like for people trying to do this on the ground and the local and the communities immediately affected. We're learning a lot of stuff from those things, hard stuff and challenges and opportunities. So a couple of things that I really like about CDR Terra and CDR Mara are taking this multidisciplinary approach, I think, is absolutely crucial. And we've had a lot of discussions actually about how do you evaluate these things, what are the criteria by which you measure the scalability of different methods. And we can clearly see, just from looking around us, that just having an estimate of the techno-economics of an option, where it is on the technology readiness scale and how much it costs, is not the sole determinant of whether these methods scale or not. We see a lot of people getting really excited about direct air carbon capture and storage, which I think is a reasonable part of the portfolio, but is arguably, the last thing you would do economically and energetically. You are expending energy just for the purpose of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and then burying it. There are other things that are cheaper. And in the UK, actually, we've had a policy of trying to plant more trees for many years. This is mainstream climate policy, and we're really struggling to do it, even though, arguably that would be a no-brainer, right? There are multiple benefits to doing that, we know, if you do it right. And yet there are clearly socio-political issues of public preference, issues of path dependency, which have a really important bearing on these things. So I think tackling the issue from a multidisciplinary angle is crucial and really important for policymakers. The second thing I like is the systems approach, because I think we really have to understand how these work within a system, not just a system of carbon removal methods, but a system of the whole economy and emissions reductions and so on. And I think, Jessica's done leading work on getting more of these removal methods into sort of the models, particularly at the global scale, because we know they've been historically very technology poor, actually. And I think we're getting to a stage where there are really interesting questions at the national level. So, direct air carbon capture and storage, planting more trees, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. These are all methods that are relatively well known now, and there's been quite a discussion at global level. But when we get down to the level of national energy systems, where we have to balance supply and demand, and we can see ramping up and ramping down of those things, in a matter of minutes, working out how these systems of carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, biomass supply might integrate with those is really crucial, and I think a really interesting frontier of research. And we can expect, I think, that the methods that work out are going to be the ones that integrate best with the systems of the day. You're not working against the grain. So that's really important. And so I'll be brief and I'll close with 3 thoughts on where I think there are real opportunities for international cooperation and engagement. And I have 3. Actually, they're all things that have been mentioned, which might make it a little bit boring as a talk, but I think is reassuring that we probably identifying common things. Number 1 is more demonstration in more locations and in a coordinated way. We've already heard that there are many different removal methods, and there are different preferences by societies about which ones they might want to go for. I don't know how many removal methods you think there are, and we can come up with different categorizations, but just to give you one example, the Rocky Mountain Institute published an innovation roadmap for carbon removal just in the last couple of days, and they categorized carbon dioxide removal into 32 different methods. So clearly this is not a number of methods that any one country can be expected to trial themselves. And even within those 32 categories, we can look at different ways in which they are delivered, different biomass feedstocks you might want to use. You might want to use forestry residues, you might want to use agricultural residues, you might want to use animal wastes. So there are many, many different permutations and combinations to these. And I think we are starting to see demonstration projects in the UK and around the world, but we are not seeing those really, in a considered way, capture the portfolio of methods at the right intervention points and in a sort of way that coordinates between countries. So 1 is demonstration projects, trialing these things. Number 2 is what we've talked about, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And Andreas spoke very well about this. I would just kind of add a specific detail. I think you can look at MRV at least a couple of different levels. 1 is at the project level, and when we talk about carbon credits, we often talk about, well, how do you measure at a project level? But the other level is at the level of national inventories. So what are countries going to report as the contribution to their nationally determined contributions internationally, or at the level of their own national climate legislation? And we know that there are clear gaps there. We don't have an agreed methodology for direct air capture. We don't have an agreed methodology for many of the marine methods, actually, at all. We don't have them for mineralization either. And so those are areas where we could have a coordinated scientific effort, and it involves working with policymakers, because as I understand it, I think it will be governments that actually have to task the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with developing these methodologies that countries then adopt. But that is a clear gap. If those things scale, we don't have a way of actually reporting and accounting for them within national action. And the final thing is data sharing, which again has been touched on. I see a need for data sharing right across the board. It's learning about which trials are going on where, keeping a registry. It's also understanding how much carbon removal is being delivered by projects that we know around the world, and understanding what is the life cycle balance of greenhouse gases across that. We really don't have good data on that. We tried with the State of CDR report, and we came up with an estimate for how much carbon removal we think is going on around the world, but it's a pretty basic estimate, and we know where the holes are. And I think one of the conclusions when you look at these global pathways is, alongside deep and widespread emissions reductions, we need to scale carbon removal incredibly fast. I think the point's been very well made that we achieve our climate targets if we do incredibly well on emissions reductions and we do incredibly well on carbon removal, and it's not really an either-or. And actually the numbers that we've calculated are, globally, we would need a 30-fold scale-up in novel carbon removal technologies this decade, and we would need something like a 1,300-fold scale-up out to 2050. So I think the only way we're going to get there is through some fairly sort of radical coordination and data sharing, which I don't really have the answer to, because that might be quite uncomfortable in situations where there are private companies who might want to, reasonably make a profit from these things. So I don't think we have really the institutional structures yet. We've got 1 or 2 things. We have a few research grants that are available for researchers across countries to collaborate on. We have Mission Innovation, which has a carbon dioxide removal stream, but none of these really capture the complete picture picture, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops over the next few years. But having international collaboration on the likes of these research projects is going to be very helpful. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you very much for your presentations. And since you already all know each other quite well, I would skip the conversation between us and just jump into the discussion with you. So what are your thoughts or questions? Do you want to comment? Just raise your hand, and we have a microphone here that I can pass around.
Thank you, Lucas, and happy to break the ice. Mads Lippgren from the Danish Ministry of Finance. You might wonder, what is a Ministry of Finance doing in a technical discussions about CDR? Well, I think the context is that the Danish government has set a very, very difficult 2030 target. We have to reduce emissions by 70%. The new government we have has also set a target of reaching 110% reduction by 2050. And none of this really makes any sense without CDR. So currently we are looking at a green tax reform of agriculture, where we're looking at pricing emissions from agriculture. And a lot of that is also looking at biochar, for example. And what we're finding there is that the technology for producing the biochar is actually there. It's possible to use it, and there are many co-benefits and so on. But I reckon what Steve was saying, that we have no way of putting these things into our national emissions inventories. And that means that we cannot say with any confidence that these technologies will actually deliver on our climate targets or our EU obligations. And it's very hard to get companies to invest when the government cannot say that what we're asking, or even incentivizing through economic means, farmers and so on to do, if that is not accounting towards climate targets. So I think my question here is really sort of how to scale up that process, how to look at both, you could say, research projects that can get emissions factors and activity data and get those things that are needed to get into emissions accounts. We're struggling with that at a national level. We really like to have input from other countries, parts of the world where that's taken forward. But I think also other issues around permitting, environmental effects and so on. You might have the biochar. Can you actually spread it onto a field? Will any farmer take the risk that you can say you might end up with toxins in the fields, or risks of that? How do you actually get to a place where the government can say with a convincing sort of face, we have the regulation in place for you to test this out in practice? That is really difficult, and it takes a long time to do. How to scale up faster within government is a very tricky thing to do.
Okay, maybe you want to take on that question? Or?
I'd like to start and then pass over to your experience from the UK. But one aspect, since you're mentioning how to get the farmers to do that without the incentivization outside, that the CDR, that they cannot get credits for it and so on, I really think that this emphasizing the co-benefits is an important point that we have not made full usage of in the past. And with many of the CDR options, definitely not with all, but with many, there are co-benefits in other realms. This is also why we speak about nature-based solutions in many cases. And nature-based solutions are not meant for most to bring down CO2 from the atmosphere, but for most to do societal and ecological benefits. And with biochar, we know that the soil carbon, that the soils improve, the water holding capacity can improve, nutrient capacity exchange, and so on. But of course, as you also mentioned, so it needs to be closely regulated to see that there's no detrimental side effects, as we've seen that with enhanced weathering. You should be really careful not to use toxic material, for example. But these are things that we have been regulating in other realms outside CDR and climate in the past. But I think to a really sustainable solution where there's also broad acceptance, we should clarify that these co-benefits are there, and maybe also in some cases we need to pay for them. So thinking, for example, of the example of agroforestry, a lot of the benefits when it comes to water availability or pollinators and so on, it's not on the field that these benefits are created, but off-site. And again, we're not doing a good job in doing that, but I think for a sustainable future, that's a low-hanging fruit, though with practical challenges. But that's just one aspect as an answer, so I hand over.
So on the question about how this stuff gets reported and accounted in national inventories, my understanding is that there is actually guidance on how to include biochar in inventories from the IPCC. I think it's supplementary and it's short, it's pretty high level. So there's probably a fair amount of scope, I would guess, to sort of improve that. But it's there. Now, and it's kind of optional guidance for countries to use. I'm not actually aware of whether any country does yet. Just speaking from the UK experience, interestingly, we've had a similar issue, or still having a similar issue. We have our own national legislation in addition to the NDCs. We call them carbon budgets to get us down to our 2050 target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And in the details of the legislation, which was written back in 2007, 2008, it turns out that removals are allowed, but it talks about removals in the land sector. And I think this was not a deliberate move to discount removal technologies. It's just that nobody thought that this was an issue back in the day. So there is discussion going on about how to amend the primary legislation wording to allow novel forms of removal in. But then you still need to have a robust system of MRV, right? And I think this is really crucial. I mean, the permitting issue is a very live one in the UK. We're finding with the work of our biochar demonstrator and our enhanced rock weathering demonstrator that a lack of clarity and complications in the permitting system is probably the main hold-up at the moment. There's a limit of 1 tonne per hectare of biochar that's allowed to be applied per year on land. And that 1 tonne is a fairly nominal number. The biochar demonstrator think that you could probably make it 10 tonnes per year, and they're not, they're fairly confident you wouldn't drive problems. But I think you also have to think about this from the point of view that if this really scales up, you won't just have inquisitive, well-meaning scientists doing this. If the carbon price goes genuinely high because we're genuinely serious about net zero, there's quite a lot of scope for people in agricultural systems to game it and maybe use undesirable feedstocks and spread them on land. And so we have permitting for a reason. But that, we're finding in the UK, it's a shared experience that clarifying, maybe simplifying the permitting process and getting the MRV right is a challenge at the moment.
Hello, Sabine Frank from... Hello. Oh yeah, now it does work. Hello, Sabine Frank from Carbon Market Watch. I'd like to home in on one of the points Oliver Gedden made about the policy challenges and the hypothesis that CDR is an indispensable solution to a problem created by the ETS review. First of all, I'd like to say CDR coming in as a solution to this problem isn't the same as incentivizing CDR through the ETS. The assumption here is that in 2040 the ETS cap will reach zero and ETS allowances will become very expensive, but in all truth we don't know yet how expensive they will become and whether even in 2040 the ETS with CDR credits eligible would actually serve to help the development of CDR. Certainly until so far that equation doesn't work. I would also say there are other solutions to the problems that we might see with the ETS in 2040 than including CDR credits. I think as far as EU policy is concerned, the way to go is to, as you mentioned, is to push for separate targets for both nature-based removals and permanent or tech removals, and then discuss the creation of separate instruments rather than rely on instruments that already exist, like the ETS. The danger of even holding out that CDR credits could come into the S in 2040 it's far too dangerous. It might have an impact on the emission reduction efforts that we will see under the ETS.
Yeah, maybe as a brief response, you're right. So there's a problem created in the ETS, but does not mean that. And for me, it's more about you need CDR to deal with that, but you don't need to integrate it into the ETS necessarily. But you will need to incentivize CDR practice to get to the volumes. Plus, the last thing we want to do is to put removal credits generated to forestry into that system. But you're right. It does not need to mean that you trade credits generated to removal practices and bring them directly into emissions trading. There are several ways, of course, how you could actually do that. What I find interesting about about the 2040, if it were 2040, and some people are saying 2039, but there are elements how to push that. But if it were in the 2030s, does mean the regulation, the discussion about the re-regulation will start in 5 years from now, or it would already end in 5 years from now. If you take the example of the original EU 2030 targets, the basic decision on the overall target level was taken in 2014, then the European Commission comes out with revised legislative proposals, and then the files were all closed in 2018, and because emissions trading, you regulate by 10-year trading phases. This discussion as a policy discussion and as a regulatory discussion will come on pretty early. There are already some countries saying, can we find ways to push it into the early 2040s, then we don't have to deal with that right now. But just say it's a differentiated system, it's coming, but the way you solve this problem, it does not have to come through emissions trading itself.
Yeah, sorry, Jan Wilkins, University of Hamburg. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm not working on CDR at all, so forgive me a stupid question. In Hamburg, we work more on social dynamics, on climate future. So I would be really interested into what you, I think, Steve, kind of pointed to, kind of the social dynamics of projects you are working with when testing these projects. I mean, there's a lot of emotions about the topic, obviously, and what we are seeing is that all questions pertaining to climate justice or justice at all are really, really important when it comes to climate futures. And I would just be curious to hear from you what you would say. I know it's a big debate, but what would you think are like 2 or 3 really crucial points if we want to advance this debate in this regard when it comes to justice? And having this discussion now very focused on Europe, on Germany, my question would be whether you think it, or how we could enter this debate on a more global scale. If I'm understanding you correctly, then of course we need CDR to a certain extent, but also then acknowledging that the diversity on a global scale with regard to mitigation. The question would be whether you think it is already existing or it is advisable to integrate this into just transition debates, integrate CDR into these debates, or what your position is on this. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's not a stupid question at all. It's a very big question, and I'm not an expert in justice, so maybe I can provide a few kind of scattering of thoughts, and then others might want to come in. There are lots of different and increasingly interesting angles to carbon dioxide removal and justice. So I think quite a lot of discussion has been had, certainly in the past when, so the justification for carbon removal has historically come out of the scientific community and the kind of global pathways that Jessica showed, which are, they're global scale models, and you end up looking at a lot of time series with curves that do this, And you end up having some quite theoretical discussions. And one of the big discussions, which is a very valid discussion, but has kind of grown out of that background, is, well, is carbon dioxide removal going to be an excuse to delay emissions reductions? And therefore, it's fundamentally unjust to be relying or sometimes even considering carbon dioxide removal. And I think, as Jessica's shown pretty convincingly, we only really get to meet our climate targets if we do an awful lot of emissions reduction and an awful lot of carbon removal. But I think in this move towards more projects that actually exist and demonstrations, we're sort of opening up a box of much more rich and interesting discussions, including about justice. So if you look in the US context, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there's huge amounts of money that the federal government has put into lots of things, including carbon removal. They're putting a lot of money into direct air capture hubs. And as I understand it, there's quite a live debate actually about they're in the deep south, and there are communities that are starting to organize saying, we don't want this imposed from a federal government level. Now, that is actually very interestingly different to the discussion in the UK. Now, we haven't actually built any direct air capture hubs in the UK, so we'll see how it pans out. But actually, the discussion about carbon capture and storage hubs more generally, which is where you'd put the DACs and BECs, has been this is an opportunity to revive our industrial heartlands that have been hollowed out. We have big industrial areas on the coast, and this is probably on the North Sea where you would put the pipelines, and this is an opportunity to bring in new industries that would now be zero carbon or low carbon or maybe even carbon negative because we have those pipelines for capture and storage. So you see these different dynamics playing around justice. And just a kind of another example, we have quite a few people we work with in Wales, and they are, and the perennial biomass crops team is based in Wales, actually. And when you're talking about growing willow or miscanthus, these are quite tall, different crops to corn or grassland or having sheep, which is kind of seen as the traditional Welsh landscape. And they talk a lot about, there's been quite a controversial history of wealthy landowners going to Wales and to Scotland and rewilding, or increasingly now for carbon credit purposes, planting trees. And it's been associated with, small crofters and landowners being pushed off their land for an environmental gain. So that's not really a kind of clear and consistent answer, but I hope it points to the fact that I think there are lots of really interesting angles to that discussion, and I think it will get more interesting as we see more and more carbon removal projects in the real world.
I'd like to add another very basic and more negotiation-centered perspective. As you all know, the global carbon budget is depleting very soon, and that's why global mitigation pathways for 1.5 usually assume a certain level of overshoot and then coming back, and that coming back comes to net negative emissions, CO2 emissions. So the question is, who's going to deliver these net negative CO2 emissions if policymakers would decide that they actually want to pursue this, which they kind of never did, although they rely on these IPCC-assessed pathways. And then, for example, India every now and then, I think it's not the official government position, but every now and then demands, okay, now the OECD countries going net negative. Because it's not just about reaching net zero earlier, but then going even further. Is that a good thing to do? Is that a bad thing? Is it just a magic bullet? We don't know. In the European Union, I mentioned that, if Poland and the Czech Republic would present that as a proposal, others going net negative, they would also, let's say, run with the argument, okay, still economically disadvantaged regions, and having not so strong targets around net zero. That means somebody else had net negative targets, and as our Danish colleague already mentioned, minus 110% by 2050. And probably there was never a discussion that somebody else would want to suck up these additional 10%, because it's Denmark, it's not that much. But we can have that discussion even in the European Union as an overall economic fairness discussion, which will get us into a strange territory, because you can be at net zero earlier and then you stay there, and then you wait for the others. If that is not enough and you enter net negative territory, it's basically bottomless, and you can say, well, minus 110, why didn't you say minus 120? because if you think you can do a lot of carbon dioxide removal, and that might turn out to be a complete game on paper full of magical bullets, but that's a way how it could even enter international negotiations, because if you assume no country goes net negative with the carbon budget we have left, the emissions trajectories will all fall off the cliff, which is also unrealistic, and I would say if you look at India also unfair. So that could be some kind of political use of the notion we will do that in the future that could become quite problematic and also distraction.
I wanted to add on the societal implications in the broader sense. So one of the main aims of CDR Terra and CDR Mare is also to estimate realistic potential. So potentials that are scrutinized for, are they low on ecological side effects? Do they make economic sense? Governance-wise, can you implement them? But then specifically also whether they're acceptable by society. And there's a range of different aspects you need to consider there. We're not comprehensive there yet, but some examples would be, for example, the surveys asking people for novel technologies like direct air capture, what they know, how it's perceived by them, and then one of our project finds, for example, that the benefits of DACs is communicated well, obviously, but the broad public knows less about the risks, cannot estimate that very well, so there needs to be more communication in that sense. Also, of course, we need the dialogue too, because every one of these CDR methods, in particular the land-based ones, has to be implemented locally, and very often together with farmers or forestry persons. And so there's a lot of dialogue with, in the agricultural sector, for example, from the farmers level to the ministries, to political decision makers, really trying to tease out what is still needed from science, or is it not the science that's the obstacle, but is it governance rules and so on. On the justice issue, it's something that has to be considered within countries, so which different players would gain more or less from certain CDR portfolios. And for example, another project does agent-based modeling to see how the land use would shift in Germany and would be allocated to different types of CDR and land uses under given boundary conditions that you can also change. And lastly, of course, Germany shouldn't be seen separately, or the UK, or whichever country, but is part of this global game. And although the first aim is to fulfill these negative emissions territorially, I do expect that CDR will change the geopolitics, because it's obvious that the potentials aren't distributed in the same way as the mitigation pledges are. And this is when I spoke about land tenure issues and rule of law before. This is also something that needs to be really made very transparent of why we tend to think of other countries could deliver that.
Just a short lobby for the ocean again. So this plays a huge role. Whenever we manipulate the ocean, this is a globally connected fluid, and it will affect the global population with long lag times sometimes. And the ocean actually has the first governance role model for marine carbon dioxide removal, ocean fertilization. There's an international agreement. Many countries have signed it. Well, a few have signed it. Many do obey it. And this is for iron fertilization. And I think that can be a role model that should be applied also for terrestrial things, where it's not so obvious that we have global consequences if we do large-scale afforestation. We change the color, we change rainfall patterns, wind patterns. There's a huge non-local risk element because the scale is so large. And I think this is one, besides of all the huge potential the ocean has, another thinking role model. How do we engage with our environment? How do we consider lags in time and non-local effects downstream? And that's what we do have, and what even terrestrial methods should have a look at.
So I guess microphone? Can I? No. Okay. No. No. Okay, I'll just take that one. So I guess this shows that this wasn't a stupid question with all the different responses you got. For the sake of time, we still have 4 questions I would ask to take 2 together. We group them twice and then proceed.
Hello, I'm Katie Lubling from the World Resources Institute. I guess following on the point about the need for international cooperation, and I guess somewhat following on the last question, I'm curious how you see the role of the Global South in researching, developing, and deploying CDR.
Attached question. We do a forest in Ethiopia, about 1,000, 2,000 hectares every year, community-based solutions. I'm pitching to our donors that it's a much more better return on invest in terms of carbon dioxide removal. It's the easiest way, the cheapest way, and has a lot of fringe benefits. So I'm a bit surprised about the discussion of how many 32 different methods we should apply in Germany. That's going to be horribly complex. It's going to be all of them going to be very small. Shouldn't we focus much more on getting policies right between EU and African countries to get the land use right problems in place, everything that's much more effective, rather than trying to develop 32 different technologies to do it in Europe?
So I think my argument was exactly that we shouldn't have individual countries doing all 32. We should have a coordinated approach because some will be better for others. But I think I'm agreeing with you actually that there are some which are going to naturally lend themselves. For some countries, Germany might want to pick off a subset. Another the UK might want to pick off a subset which overlaps but is slightly different. But if we have a way of coordinating that, we can probably rapidly expand our knowledge much faster than if we all did our own different thing or all tried to do the 32 individually and separately. To your point about the role of the Global South, that's a really interesting one. I mean, just an anecdote from the State of CDR work, when we tried to estimate how much carbon removal is happening, one continual theme that came up was that biochar is a thing, and it's really not on a lot of people's radars in this discussion. And there's probably a lot of it happening in various parts of what we might call the Global South. And it was the one we probably had the poorest amount of data on because while it's a carbon removal method, it's not always done purely for the carbon benefits. It's got a lot of carbon benefits. So a lot of people who manage land and work in agriculture will do it. And they'll do it at small scales. Quite often, they can even cut an oil drum in half and make biochar in that and then spread it on the ground. So there's just really poor data about where is that happening, how much is it happening, what are the benefits, what's the actual carbon balance of doing that. So there are probably areas where the Global South is kind of ahead of us, certainly in terms of deployment. The UK hardly does any biochar. I think the conversation is a little bit more developed in Germany, but probably not as much as other parts of the Global South. There are probably other areas where I think the principle is definitely right that we should be involving them. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts actually and the thoughts of others on where we could partner with those, because I think that's something we realized when we did the State of CDR work. There's probably a lot of opportunities we're missing.
Yeah, I think if a country like Ethiopia has the potential for reforestation and that's cheap, that's fantastic and that's absolutely necessary. However, we've seen that the global need for carbon removal is probably of the order of 5 gigatons, potentially more. And I'm not sure that can be delivered by reforestation alone. And also countries like Germany or the EU in general, they have their net zero targets. And I think they are to be understood as regionally net zero, not to be offset by other countries. And the potential, and that then relates to the question about the Global South, that the potential for reforestation and also for enhanced rock weathering is much larger in tropical regions than, for example, in Northern Europe or also, maybe Canada or whatever. And that speaks for really, or that calls for developing a large portfolio, because if we would rely on land-based options and maybe enhanced weathering, we would neglect options like direct air capture with CCS, for example, then that would mean that we would have options with a large potential in the tropical regions, and we would sort of leave them with the responsibility to supply CDR for the whole world. And so if we don't want that, we don't want to move responsibility to other countries, then we need to develop a broad portfolio, including these technical options, so that the potential for deploying CDR is better balanced across the globe.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Ernesto Fori. I'm from Ghana, West Africa, and I'm with the Green Africa Youth Organization, popularly known as GAYO. I am a novice in this whole conversation. I'm not a pro, but what I know is that in Africa, to be precise, the total emissions for Africa is 4%, which is like 1.45 billion tons. And obviously, you could tell that Africa is not emitting, but the repercussions of the emissions are being felt by the global south. Well, and if you could clearly look at the room, you could see that there are no black folks here because of one thing, that is the knowledge gap. The capacity of people in the African region are not built. The knowledge in CDR is not there. When you look at a country like Ghana, what we are focused on is emission reduction and not carbon removal, hence the carbon market. So Ghana is really doing well with the carbon market. They are having a beautiful trade with Australia and other European countries. But my question is, I mean, looking at that capacity gap, would there be a need for a collaboration between some organizations in Africa, like the Green African Youth Organization, to help build the capacity of young people? Even though we emit less, the impact is felt mostly in the global sites, like Ghana. So if we can also contribute insignificantly, I believe that it would add up to what you guys are doing in Europe and other parts of the world to help reach that net zero that will help save the world to reaching tipping points and also the various catastrophe that would come as a result of negligence.
Also, first, thank you for this really, really interesting conversation. My name is Tanja Verkau. I run a non-profit platform that tackles a couple of the sustainability problems. And my question goes a little bit into the area of collaboration or silo. Don't you think that we actually need more collaboration on that? We have heard a very scientific view of the thing, but don't we need to bring it all together? Economy, civil society, science, and economy?
I fully agree with what you've just said. These are mostly science projects, but they all try very much to get this dialogue into these different parts. In some cases, there's also companies being brought on board with some of developing these novel methods, also in view of how can this be scaled up, because in the end it needs to be implemented, what could be the economic incentives behind it, and so on. And society is brought on board. We spoke about that earlier. So exactly, you're absolutely right. So we need the scientific foundation, but we, again, thinking of these realistic potentials, we need to consider how is it economically implemented and what are the societal implications thereof. Fully agree, and also I think, I'm speaking for all of us, it's also part of the reason why we are here, why we made this trip to Dubai.
And maybe adding to that, I think it would make a lot of sense to have these kinds of collaborations, because, like, to underline it again, there's lots of potential in tropical countries, not just in African countries, but also in African countries, especially for reforestation and for enhanced rock weathering, also for things like soil carbon sequestration, agroforestry, and these are all options that could also, on top of the carbon removal effect, could have regional co-benefits for yields, for the microclimate. So building up these kinds of collaborations and bridging the knowledge and the capacity gap would be quite helpful.
All right, so
I think from the ocean view again, I think also for land we need this registry of things that are going on to have transparent data sharing, information changing, but it's not scientific data. Science and academia is far too slow. We can't rely on that. Would take decades, and we can't reach the climate goals that way. But we need knowledge, and we have a lot of knowledge out there, which is local often, but we have to tell each other about it. And we have to tell each other about the failed things as well. That's probably 90%, as usual in life. But this is important knowledge, and nobody has to be ashamed of that. But we need to learn from that, and we have to provide incentives. And this voluntary carbon market that we have might be able to provide these incentives. I think it doesn't do it right now well, but we can push that, and we are trying to that, like having transparent MRV schemes, to also push for data sharing, information sharing of all information, also of the so-called failed experiments, which often are the most useful ones. And we need to push this voluntary market, which so far has stimulated a lot of development. Also some, well, but it has to be shared. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, so to conclude, we won't forget the ocean. Actually, we had the idea to make a round of conclusions, but I really enjoyed the discussions. And I also think the debate or the discussion we had shows that we aren't really at a point to conclude right now if we want to discuss CDR. So thank you very much for that very lively discussion. If you want to pick it up, you can find us online, the CDR Mare, as well as the core project and CDR Terra, or the scientists involved individually. And we are looking forward to stay in touch and keep a discussion going. And yeah, so this is how I would say thank you very much for coming. Also, thank you very much to the DLR for organizing this event. And have a nice evening.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.